How did I make it big? I know how to play the game. I buy real estate, hotels, fancy cars, even railroads. And I take chances. To make it big, you've got to play the game. I'm Monopoly.
The sound of dice rattling, the soft clink of little metal tokens being moved across colorful squares, and the slow but inevitable descent into cutthroat financial warfare, Monopoly. For many, it's the ultimate family game, a seemingly innocent competition of chance and strategy where friendships are tested and sibling rivalries are torn apart. But behind the pastel-colored properties and grinning mascot lies a far darker story, one of theft, betrayal, and corporate greed. You see, Monopoly isn't just a game, it's a war. And at the heart of this war lies a woman named Elizabeth Magee, who, like so many figures in history, was chewed up by the machine she helped create.
Give me your money, lady.
But let's start at the beginning, because no one gets into the board game business without a little madness. The birth of the Landlord's game. Before Monopoly, there was another game. A game invented not by some corporate think tank in a Manhattan skyscraper, but by a fierce, brilliant woman named Elizabeth Magee. The year was 1903. And Magee was about as far from your typical board game inventor as one could imagine. She was a stenographer by trade, but beyond that, she was an outspoken critic of capitalism and an ardent supporter of the single tax theory proposed by Henry George. Magee's idea was that land monopolies were the root of all social inequality, and so she did what any rational person would do. She invented a board game to prove her point. This wasn't just any game, though. Magee's The Landlord's Game was a simulation designed to educate players about the dangers of unchecked greed and the inherent unfairness of monopolies.
Yeah. Okie dokie.
There were two ways to play: a prosperity version, where everyone could benefit when wealth was shared, and a monopoly version, where one player ruthlessly crushed the others under the heel of their capitalistic boot. Let that sink in for a second. The game you know and love was originally meant as a critique of the very system it now seems to celebrate. But the story, like all good stories, is not so simple. The game that started a revolution, Magee, far ahead of her time, took her game and filed a patent in 1904. She wasn't just interested in selling a few copies, she wanted to spread her message. The Landlord's Game was meant to be a teaching tool, a way to warn future generations about the dangers of monopoly, the real-world kind, and for a while it worked. People began playing the game in small circles, passing the rules along like some underground pamphlet in a time of political revolution. You could almost imagine it, a dark, smoky room full of intellectuals and activists huddled around a board game, pondering the fate of humanity over paper money and property cards. The game took root in progressive communities, on college campuses, and among left-wing activists. Magee, at this point, might have thought she'd succeeded. After all, the game was spreading, it was being played. Her message, she believed, was getting through. But as the dice would have it, that wasn't exactly what happened. Enter Charles Darrow, the snake in the grass. Here's where things take a turn for the sinister. By the 1930s, a man named Charles Darrow enters the picture. Unemployed and desperate during the Great Depression, Darrow stumbled upon the Landlord's Game, and like any morally bankrupt opportunist, saw a chance to make a quick buck. He copied the concept, tweaked a few details, and slapped his own name on it. Boom! Monopoly was born. Except, of course, it wasn't. But that didn't stop Darrow from pitching the game to Parker Brothers, a major board game manufacturer. The story goes that he sold them on this charming narrative about an out-of-work man coming up with a game to support his family during hard times. You know, the classic American dream. Everyone loves a good rags to riches story after all, and Parker Brothers bought it literally and figuratively. Darrow became a millionaire practically overnight, and Monopoly exploded into the cultural consciousness. It became the game that everyone was playing, especially as families looked for cheap entertainment during the tail end of the Great Depression. The Forgotten Creator. Now, if you think this is where Elizabeth Magie rides in on a white horse and gets the credit she deserves, you're about to be deeply disappointed. Parker Brothers, perhaps in a rare moment of guilt, or maybe just trying to avoid a lawsuit, did reach out to Magie. They offered her $500 for the patent on the Landlord's game, with no royalties and no recognition.
These must be branded as lies.
And after years of being overlooked and having her game copied by others, she took it. $500, that's all she got. Charles Darrow, meanwhile, was swimming in money like a damn cartoon character diving into a vault full of gold coins. To add insult to injury, Parker Brothers then went on to bury the Landlord's game. They stopped producing it almost immediately. The message that Magie had tried so hard to spread about the dangers of monopolies, about economic inequality, was silenced. Monopoly, as we know it, became the opposite of everything she stood for. The corporate takeover. Monopoly wasn't just a board game, it became an institution. By the 1950s, it was one of the most popular games in the world, and here's where things start to get real dystopian. Monopoly, the game, began to mirror the very monopolistic practices it once sought to criticize. The game's publisher, now Hasbro, became an unmovable force in the toy industry, swallowing up smaller companies, acquiring brands left and right, and eventually becoming one of the largest toy and board game companies in the world. In a bitter twist of irony, Monopoly became a monopoly. But even as the game evolved and changed over the decades, with special editions, themed versions, and even video games, Elizabeth Magie remained in the shadows of history. For a long time, her name was all but forgotten. It wasn't until recent years that her contribution to the game started to receive some recognition, but even now, it's Charles Darrow who's often remembered as Monopoly's creator. Monopoly's real-world impact. Monopoly in reality extends far beyond a simple board game. It's a chilling reflection of how industries have shaped and often warped our economy. Take Standard Oil, for example. At its peak in the early 1900s, the company controlled 90% of the U.S. oil market. John D. Rockefeller's fortune, adjusted for inflation, swelled to an astounding $336 billion, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in history. His monopoly ruthlessly wiped out competitors and inflated prices, much like landing on boardwalk with a hotel drains every last dollar from monopoly players. Small businesses stood no chance, and consumers found themselves paying increasingly steep prices just to stay afloat. Similarly, during the late 19th century, the railroad industry saw its own monopolistic giants rise to power. 4 companies held 90% of the market, controlling vital transportation routes. They leveraged this control to raise freight costs, leaving small towns and local industries struggling to compete. The cost of living for rural families skyrocketed while wages stagnated. A familiar story in America's history of economic disparity. In fact, by 1890, the average annual wage for industrial workers was around $438, while inflation soared and basic necessities like food and rent consumed over 50% of that income. Much like Monopoly, the winners in this game of real-life capitalism were those who monopolized the market, leaving the rest to pay the price. Road to bankruptcy. Owning all the properties of one color is basically a metaphor for being the final boss of a dystopian housing crisis. Once you control those pastel-colored squares, you get to crank up the rent like some kind of cartoonish landlord with a monocle and a soul darker than burnt toast. Your opponents, now reduced to financial roadkill, pay through the nose just for daring to exist in your domain. It's basically a microcosm of the real world, where monopolistic corporations jack up prices and choke out competition like they're collecting rent in a nightmare version of Candyland. Economists call this rent-seeking, which sounds polite, but it's really just glorified looting. No extra productivity, no betterment of society, just a slow and steady siphoning of everyone else's money. And if you think you can mortgage your way out of the mess, well, welcome to the debt trap. Sure, you can pawn your properties, but it's like taking a payday loan to pay off your gambling debts. You're still headed for financial oblivion. Monopoly teaches one brutal truth. Once wealth gets concentrated, the rest of the players are just spectators in a capitalist circus, watching their money disappear while the rich get richer. It's like late-stage capitalism, but with fewer riots and more tiny metal top hats. Soul for sale. Somewhere in the 1970s and 1980s, Monopoly underwent what can only be described as a corporate lobotomy. Licensing deals started popping up like some sort of mutated hydra. Then there's Monopoly Go, the mobile version that's turned the game into a digital casino thinly veiled as fun for the family. Questionable marketing strategies? Check. Luring players into spending billions? Check. It's the Vegas of mobile games, where you're never sure if you're playing a game or just funding some dark corporate overlord's private island retreat. The game's critics say it's nothing short of predatory, with mechanics designed to drain wallets faster than you can say, "Do not pass go." All these licensing contracts, mobile versions, and tournaments, they've turned Monopoly into an empire, a bloated, shambling empire that's drifted far from its roots.
You can even play against me, and if you're good enough, you might win my lucky dice.
What once was a biting commentary on the perils of capitalism has become a capitalist product itself, wrapped up in shiny branding, plastic hotels, and a mobile app that feels eerily like gambling addiction in a bowler hat.
After 7 years in the making and 250 million downloads later, it's making about $4 million a day, more than traditional casinos. I mean, all respectable numbers, looking at how fiercely competitive the mobile gaming market actually is. With $90 billion, it accounts for half of the global games market. China is leading, followed by the US and Europe. And with 60% of Americans playing mobile games, it's not surprising to learn that the US is publishing most of them.
Landing on Boardwalk is like getting hit by a financial truck. With only a 2.6% chance of landing there, it's rare. But when you do, that $2,000 rent with a hotel feels like instant bankruptcy. Compare that to Baltic Avenue, where the rent maxes out at $450, practically a sneeze compared to Boardwalk's sledgehammer. Now imagine this in real life. Take Manhattan, where the median rent for a one-bedroom apartment is around $4,000. In an impoverished neighborhood, that same apartment might only cost $800. The difference is staggering, but it's not just about rent, it's about who even gets to play. In Monopoly, everyone starts with $1,500. But in the real world, wealth isn't so evenly distributed. Some people are born into families with $1,500, others $5,000, $10,000, or $100,000, rigging the game from the start. Economically, this mirrors the Matthew effect. The rich get richer, and the poor get left behind. If you start with 10 times the resources, like someone born into wealth, you're not just ahead, you're playing an entirely different game. You invest in high-yield assets, like real estate in Manhattan or stocks.
37.9 million. That's the number of Americans currently living in poverty, accounting for 11.6% of the total population. That's despite the fact that America ranks first as the richest nation in the world in terms of GDP.
While those stuck on Baltic Avenue struggle just to survive, the reality is wealth isn't just about how well you play. It's about where you start. Some people are born into the equivalent of Boardwalk, while others start on Baltic, and in both Monopoly and life, the game is anything but fair. If this narrative resonated with you, do support us. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe. Thank you for staying with us to the end. See you in the next video on Plaid Chronicles.